Have you ever really stopped to think about how those big decisions made way up high, in Washington, how they actually trickle down and, hit your wallet, your job, or even how America deals with other countries?
Yeah, it's often way more complicated than it looks on the surface, isn't it?
Exactly.
Today we're doing a deep dive into former President Trump's, let's say, unique approach to foreign policy and economics. We're really focusing on tariffs and what things might look like in a potential second term.
Okay.
And we've got a pretty solid stack of sources here, everything from, serious academic studies, university economists, to detailed analyses from think tanks, government agencies, too.
Right. A lot to sift through. So our mission here is basically to cut through all that noise, pull out the really important bits, and help you get up to speed on what can seem like a really tangled picture.
Definitely. We want to unpack the actual economic effects of these trade policies and also look at those maybe quieter forces shaping U.S. foreign policy, especially over in East Asia.
Okay, let's get into it. Tariffs. We hear so much debate about who really pays for them. What does the evidence actually tell us? Is it clear?
Well, what's really striking is how consistently the data sort of contradicts a very common claim. Former President Trump repeatedly said tariffs are taxes on foreign countries, that they don't affect us here.
Right, I remember hearing that a lot.
But honestly, the overwhelming evidence, we're talking a dozen or more academic studies, think tanks like Peterson Institute, government agencies, plus just stories from businesses, they all pretty much conclude that American consumers, both companies and individuals, paid the price for those tariffs. And likely would again.
Okay, so it's not the foreign countries footing the bill, it's us. What does that actually mean for, say, the average American family's budget?
It hits home, yeah. These studies, they estimated that Trump's tariffs added costs for the average American household of about $830 per year.
$830.
Per year. And that includes the direct costs, plus, the ripple effects, the inefficiencies. Looking further out, the Penn Wharton Budget Model, they do these long-term projections. They estimated a middle-income household could face something like a $22,000 lifetime loss because of these tariffs.
Wow, $22,000. That's significant. Over a lifetime, sure, but still.
It adds up. It's a real hit to household wealth.
And beyond those direct costs to families, what about the broader economy? What were the other impacts?
Right, connecting the dots, the tariffs themselves, and the retaliation we saw from other countries, that definitely led to pretty substantial losses for the U.S. economy overall.
How so?
Well, it's not just higher prices, though that's part of it. You also saw a bigger tax burden in some ways. People bought less. There was a hit to wages and jobs. Businesses invested less, and our exports went down. It all kind of adds up to what economists call, a drag on overall prosperity. The country as a whole is just a bit less well off.
It sounds like businesses, not just shoppers, really felt that pinch too.
Oh, absolutely. Just look at the U.S. Trade Representatives review process. They got almost 1,500 comments from American companies talking about the real-world problems. Input costs soaring, making it harder to invest in their own workers or equipment.
So companies were complaining directly.
Yes, and we even saw Republican lawmakers getting worried. They were hearing it from their constituents, business owners, exporters, farmers. Senator Rand Paul mentioned a deluge of complaints in Kentucky.
Yep.
Cargo shippers, farmers, bourbon makers.
Bourbon makers, right.
And Senator Susan Collins warned a 25% tariff on Canadian imports could be, quote, devastating for paper mills up in Maine. It wasn't abstract theory. It was like chilling business sentiment.
Okay, so if the tariffs were causing these problems, why did the government then have to step in with aid, especially for farmers? Doesn't that kind of contradict the idea they were purely beneficial?
That's exactly the point critics hammered home. The federal government ended up spending somewhere between $20 and $30 billion to help out farmers during Trump's first term.
Billion, with a B.
Billion. Specifically to cushion the blow from the retaliatory tariffs China and others put on U.S. farm goods. So, yeah, needing to borrow money immediately to compensate the very people harmed by the policy that really highlighted what critics called the fallacy of the whole approach for them.
It raises a good question then. How do tariffs compare to other ways the government could raise money? Are they like an efficient tool for that?
The Penn Wharton Budget Model looked at this directly, and their answer is pretty clear. While, yeah, tariffs can bring in revenue, potentially a lot, they projected maybe over $5 trillion over 10 years in some scenarios.
Okay, that's huge revenue.
It is, but they're way more damaging, more distorting to the economy than other ways to get that same money. like, say, raising corporate taxes.
Much more damaging.
Their analysis suggested tariffs would cut GDP and wages by more than twice as much as raising the corporate income tax from 21% to 36%. And keep in mind, even that corporate tax hike is generally considered a pretty distorting tax itself.
So tariffs are like extra distorting.
Exactly. Plus, all this tariff talk created a lot of uncertainty. There's this thing called the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, basically a measure of how nervous businesses feel about future government policy. By March 2025, in this scenario, it hit its highest point since the pandemic started.
And uncertainty is bad for business.
Right. It makes companies hesitant to invest, to hire. So for you, the listener, the bottom line is pretty clear. This isn't just economics jargon. It affects how much things cost. It affects job opportunities. It affects the whole economic climate you're living in.
Okay, the economic side is stark. But let's switch gears to foreign policy. Trump's America First idea, it promised this huge shift, right? Especially in Asia. But I was actually surprised reading our sources. It seems like, despite the talk, the actual policy in East Asia didn't change quite as radically as expected. What's the story there?
Yeah, that's one of the really fascinating takeaways. Despite all the very strong rhetoric about changing things up, U.S. policy in East Asia during his first term, well, it mostly stayed on what you might call autopilot. It looked a lot like what previous presidents had done.
Autopilot. So why? Was it intentional or?
A lot of analysts attribute it less to a strategic choice and more to, frankly, Trump's lack of deep knowledge on the issues, his inexperience in how government actually works, and that made it hard for him to really organize a sustained push to overhaul policies. The existing system, the institutions, kind of kept things on track.
So the establishment, so to speak, wasn't necessarily fighting him tooth and nail, but just sort of kept doing its thing.
Pretty much. You had key figures, Defense Secretary Mattis, National Security Advisor McMaster, Chief of Staff John Kelly. These were often generals Trump admired, described as being surprisingly conventional in their views. They consistently argued against doing things that would damage alliances, especially with South Korea and Japan. They leaned on their expertise, supported the existing system. Even Secretary of State Tillerson, Trump's own pick initially, emphasized alliances and clearly wasn't on board with a lot of the America First isolationist ideas. They acted as a kind of institutional ballast.
Interesting. But what about the people in the White House who were true believers in America First, like Steve Bannon or Peter Navarro on trade? Did they just get sidelined?
Largely, yes. Figures like Bannon and Navarro, with his pretty unorthodox protectionist views, they found their influence was pretty limited. Navarro's National Trade Council, for example, was reportedly kind of a paper tiger. It existed, but he was working out of a small office, struggling to get his ideas consistently into actual policy. It really shows you the power of the existing government machinery, you know? The bureaucracy, the institutional knowledge, it can often slow down or even block presidential impulses if they aren't relentlessly driven and translated into concrete action.
So did that autopilot mean things stayed relatively stable diplomatically in Asia, despite the rhetoric?
For the most part, yes. Despite Trump's public complaints about allies, the administration actually continued and in some areas expanded diplomatic engagement in East Asia, especially Southeast Asia. Vice President Pence, Secretary Tillerson, they spent time reassuring allies.
Okay.
And even the so-called deep state, the career civil servants, played a role. Think about the State Department's human rights reports. They're required by law, and they kept coming out on schedule, even if the political leadership wasn't focused on them. That shows the resilience of the process.
Right.
But there was one area where Trump's personal style did make a difference. His direct outreach to some of the more illiberal leaders in Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia. Now, sometimes this was framed as just being realist, but the signal it sent to the region was maybe, cracking down on democracy or human rights wouldn't necessarily hurt your relationship with the U.S. anymore. So personal instincts could still nudge policy, even if the big structure stayed put.
Got it. Okay, let's bring it to the present, or at least the near future scenario. A key player now is Secretary of State Marco Rubio. What does his appointment tell us about the U.S. approach to China and Asia going forward?
Well, Rubio becoming Secretary of State sends a pretty unambiguous signal. Expect a continued, maybe even intensified, hawkish stance toward China.
How so?
I mean, look at his first day. His immediate priority was meetings with his counterparts from the Quad countries, the U.S., India, Japan, Australia. That tells you a lot. And Rubio himself has been incredibly blunt, calling China, and I quote, the most potent, dangerous, and near-peer adversary this nation has ever confronted.
That's strong language.
Yeah.
And the Quad, it keeps popping up.
Yeah.
Why is this group suddenly so important? What's its story?
Right, so the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, it actually started back in 2007, mainly for disaster relief after that big tsunami in the Indian Ocean.
Oh, I didn't realize it was that old.
Yeah, but then it kind of went dormant for about 10 years. It got revived during Trump's first term, then really picked up steam under President Biden. Defense cooperation got much deeper. Now it's seen as a key forum for countries worried about China's actions, its claims in the South China Sea, its pressure on Taiwan, its military buildup.
It's like an anti-China alliance.
Yeah.
Beijing calls it an Asian NATO, right?
Yeah, Beijing definitely dismisses it that way. But the Quad members themselves always stress it's about maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific. Still, there's no doubt it's become a central part of the U.S. strategy for competing with China in the region. It really puts that question of balancing competition and stability front and center.
So, given Rubio's tough talk and the Quad focus, is his approach just pure confrontation with China? Or is there any wiggle room?
His rhetoric definitely leans heavily into confrontation. He talks about needing a whole-of-society effort to take on China, and often seems to view the world in zero-sum terms. If China gains, the U.S. loses.
Any examples?
Well, he criticized the Biden administration for shutting down the Justice Department's China initiative, even with all the concerns about racial profiling. And he consistently says the defining threat of this century is China, sometimes sounding like he's downplaying other big challenges, like climate change.
Okay, that sounds pretty hardline. But I thought I read somewhere he supported normalizing trade with Central Asia. That seems different. Am I mixing things up?
No, you're spot on. And this is where you see an interesting bit of nuance or maybe pragmatism. Despite the tough line on China, Rubio has actually come out in favor of normalizing trade with countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan in Central Asia.
Why? That seems counterintuitive.
He specifically called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, this old Cold War law restricting trade with certain countries, a relic. His reasoning seems to be strategic. He recognizes Central Asia's important energy resources, location, and sees removing this old trade barrier as a way for the U.S. to compete better with China's growing economic influence there.
Ah, okay. So it's still about competing with China, just using trade as a tool in that specific region.
Exactly. It shows a willingness to be pragmatic, to use different tools to advance American interests, even if the overarching narrative is confrontation with Beijing.
So a mix of hardline rhetoric and some pragmatic moves. But how do the tariffs we talked about earlier fit into this?
Yeah.
Could they actually undermine Rubio's diplomatic efforts, especially in Asia?
That's the potential collision course, yeah.
Right.
Rubio's first big trip to Asia, planned for July 2025 in this scenario, could be seriously overshadowed by the threat of Trump's new broad tariffs.
How so?
Well, Trump has already put several countries on notice, including key Asian allies like Japan and South Korea, about possibly facing 25% tariffs if they don't agree to new trade deals. Even Malaysia, the country hosting the big security conference Rubio is supposed to attend, could get hit with 25% tariffs on their electronics.
Ouch. So Rubio goes to talk security cooperation, while their main export is potentially getting hammered by U.S. tariffs.
Precisely. As one former diplomat, Danny Russell, put it pretty bluntly, Rubio's talking points on the China threat will not resonate with officials whose industries are being battered by 30-40% tariffs.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And you even had the Malaysian Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, saying that ASEAN, the group of Southeast Asian nations, would respond to U.S. tariffs as a united bloc, framing it as a challenge comparable to Chinese pressure. It just highlights how economic policy can directly undercut your diplomatic goals, putting allies in a really tough spot.
Wow. We've definitely covered a lot today. We started by really digging into how those tariffs from the previous administration, well, they cost American families and businesses real money. Even folks within the Republican Party were getting concerned.
Right. And then we saw how Trump's foreign policy, despite the America First talk, was often kind of kept in check by the existing government structures and more conventional advisors, although his personal actions, like reaching out to those illiberal leaders, still had an impact.
And now, looking ahead with Marco Rubio at the State Department, there's this clear focus on China, using alliances like the Quad. But interestingly, also this pragmatic streak, like wanting to normalize trade with Central Asia to compete with China there.
But hanging over all of it is the potential conflict with those same broad tariff policies potentially coming back into play, undermining the diplomacy.
Which really leaves us with a big question for you, the listener, to chew on. In this world that's so interconnected, how do you balance that desire for, national self-reliance, strategic competition, with the very real economic costs and diplomatic friction these policies can cause. What does putting America first truly look like when your domestic economy and your global alliances seem to be pulling in opposite directions?